Hej och välkomna till Ntd Nyheter. Jag heter Cecilia Samuelsson. Här är våra rubriker. Vad är det verkliga motivet bakom huthierebellernas attacker? FNs biståndsorgan UNWRA står inför allvarliga terroristanklagelser. Vi får en analys. Hur många NATO-länder kommer att uppfylla utgiftsmålet 2024? NATO-chefen svarar. Kina ställer in 2 matcher med fotbollsstjärnan Lionel Messi. Ntd specialserie om kommunismen, denna gång om revolution på export till Latinamerika och Afrika. Varför attackerar huthierebellerna containerfartyg i Röda havet? De säger att det är för att hjälpa Gaza, men experter menar att det finns ett djupare och mörkare motiv.
Under flera månader har huthierebellerna attackerat containerfartyg i Röda havet och stört den globala handeln. Terroristgruppen säger sig hjälpa Gaza och vill hindra last från att nå Israel.
The Houthis have seized on a convenient narrative that played into something that they wanted.
Sjöfartsexperten Ian Roby sa till lagstiftarna den 30 januari att den palestinska saken inte är huthierebellernas verkliga motiv. Han sa också att huthierebellerna har en låg respekt för mänskligt liv, även för människorna i deras eget land.
Their main objective is to advance their own movement. Their movement includes goals to not only take over the remainder of Yemen, but to advance on both Mecca and ultimately Jerusalem. They see this as a global movement.
Roby menar att oavsett hur många gånger väst slår till mot dem så kommer de att fortsätta att attackera sjöfarten. Om väst förstör alla deras missiler och drönare kommer de att hitta andra sätt, till exempel fjärrstyrda bombåtar eller obemannade undervattensvapensystem. Attackerna inleddes i november och fortsätter fortfarande att utföras mot containerfartyg.
For them to be shot at, as they were 3 different times on our fleet, one of which was an hour-long firefight that they were directly in the middle of, is just unacceptable. We've got to find a way to make the shooting stop.
Bud Dar är chef på MSC Shipping Company. Han säger att den här serien av attacker saknar motstycke. Det första som dessa containerfartyg behöver är bättre kommunikationsutrustning.
Right now we're using basically the radio or mobile phones if we're fortunate enough to have the connectivity. But having the communications with the combat vessels is vital.
David Heindel är ordförande för Seafarers International Union. Han säger att det går 75 minuter mellan det att en missil avfyras och det att det träffar ett fartyg. Han sa att snabbare kommunikation skulle hjälpa fartyget att undvika fara. En fara som USA kan ha hjälpt till att orsaka.
In 2018, the US was part of a major effort to prevent the government of Yemen from retaking the port of Hodeidah on the Red Sea coast. That is now a critical strategic failure on our part, because if the government of Yemen controlled that sea access, we would perhaps not be having the same conversation we're having today.
Vid den tiden ville USA inte att Jemens regering skulle få tillgång till hamnen i Hodeidah av humanitära skäl. Nu kontrollerar huthierebellerna hamnen och använder den för att inleda sina attacker.
Det har rörts upp starka känslor sedan flera länder inklusive Sverige har avbrutit sin finansiering till FN-organet UNWRA. Detta efter att en israelisk underrättelserapport hävdar att UNWRA-arbetare deltog i Hamas massaker den 7 oktober förra året. Då fler än 1200 människor dödades och över 200 personer inklusive barn och äldre togs som gisslan och fördes till Gaza enligt regeringskansliet. Ntd's Tiffany Meyer har pratat med Gerard Felitti för att utforska skandalen kring FNs biståndsorgan UNWRA. Han är en civilrättsadvokat och senior rådgivare vid Lawfare Project. Intervjun spelades in den 29 januari.
Gerard Felitti, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you back on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
To begin, Israel is alleging that 12 employees of a United Nations agency, UNRWA, were involved in the October 7th Hamas terrorist attack in Gaza. How serious are these allegations?
No, this is very serious, and actually it's a lot more than 12. 12 are the number that they've identified by name and face. Right now, they believe at least 190 UNRWA employees were involved to some extent with Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or other terrorist groups that carried out the October 7 atrocities. And this is absolutely terrifying.
Now, this UN agency has pushed back against those allegations, but following those allegations, the U.S. and other countries have cut off funding. Now, this has reignited debate over humanitarian aid that gets into Gaza. Where do you see all of this going?
Well, UNWRA is a very flawed institution. This is not the first time that we've heard that there are problems with what they do in Gaza and with the Palestinians. For many years, there have been allegations substantiated by evidence that they teach anti-Semitism in those schools, that they use examples, even in math problems, that are blatantly anti-Semitic and encourage jihad and encourage suicide attacks against the Israeli civilian population. This is what UNWRA has been doing. So it's not a surprise for anyone to see the number of people involved with this. Cutting funding is something that's happened before and will happen again.
On that note, Israel's foreign minister is calling for UNRWA's commissioner to resign following these allegations. Now, what steps are needed for the public's trust to be restored in agencies like this?
Well, quite frankly, I'm not even sure if it's possible to regain public trust after all of these allegations. But the United Nations needs to clean house. Philippe Lazzarini, the head of UNRWA, needs to go. We need to see systemic change within that organization. And quite frankly, we need UNRWA itself restructured. We don't need an organization that victimizes people by keeping them in victim status as refugees for generations. We need actual help for people on the ground, and that's not what UNRWA is set up to do.
Now, these allegations come as the World Court was hearing arguments of South Africa's accusations of Israel committing genocide in Gaza. Now, some are saying there is no such talk about genocide against Israel inside Gaza. What's your take on all of this?
No, that's exactly the problem. We're talking about Israel committing genocide, which is absurd, but the United Nations is ignoring, the World Court, the legal body of the United Nations, is ignoring the terrorist atrocities. This is a double standard unlike any we've seen in recent times. We really need to be addressing who the real victims are, and that's the Israeli civilian population.
And on that note, this does come as there are still over 100 hostages being held in Gaza. What do you see as the next steps here? Is it hostage release, ceasefire, a new governing body in Gaza?
Well, all of the above. We have seen active negotiations moderated in Qatar to have the hostages released in an exchange for Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails. We do expect that there will be some agreement on a humanitarian pause, but ultimately the only way to end this crisis, to end this war, is regime change. Hamas needs to go.
And what steps are needed to move that forward?
You know, in part militarily, and Israel's been doing a great job degrading Hamas's ability to continue carrying out the war, but we also need international pressure. The Palestinian people, all people, they can't live under dictatorship, under Islamist regimes that want to do as much damage to their own people as to others. So there needs to be a fundamental pressure for change from other Arab countries as well, and to delegitimize Hamas, to no longer treat it as a legitimate organ of anything, and instead consider it as the terrorist organization it is.
And how do you see all the pro-Palestinian protests we're seeing around the world fitting into that?
Well, that's a narrative that is going hand in hand with the accusations of genocide. We're seeing this violent rhetoric against Jews that has been with us for a long time. The problem is this rhetoric is only making things worse. We need steadfast leadership. We need clarity, and we need to make it clear that this is nothing but naked support for terrorist violence. This is not humanitarian pro-Palestinian sympathizers. These are people who want to create a violent environment in Israel and around the world, and we need to stand united against them.
Gerard Felitti, thank you so much for your time.
Always a pleasure, thank you.
Den tidigare presidenten Donald Trump har fått mothugg från europeiska ledare och amerikanska politiker för sina kommentarer om att NATO-medlemmar inte fullgör sina finansiella åtaganden.
You didn't pay, you're delinquent. He said, yes, let's say that happened. No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. You got to pay. You got to pay your bills.
Ntd har pratat med Bart Marcois för att ge sin syn på den tidigare presidenten Trumps kommentarer om NATO. Han är en före detta amerikansk diplomat och en före detta biträdande minister för internationella frågor.
Bart Marcois, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you back on the show.
Thanks, Tiffany. Always a pleasure to be with you.
To begin, world leaders are contemplating a return of Trump to the White House. Now, that's after Trump's remarks on the weekend, where he was saying that when he was president, he told the leaders of NATO that he would look the other way if Russia were to invade. Now, the head of NATO said his suggestion, quote, undermines all of our security. What do you make of Trump's remarks here?
Well, I love this issue. It's a perfect illustration of what a friend of mine describes as they'll take what you say, they'll twist it into something you didn't say, and then they'll condemn you for something you didn't say. Trump told a story to a rally, and what he was doing was boasting of his ability to negotiate. And he was talking about NATO. When he came into NATO, most of our NATO allies were woefully under their committed levels of spending. Every NATO member has committed to spend at least 2% of their gross domestic product, their GDP, on defense spending. Now, the U.S. spends 4.5%. Finland, Lithuania, Latvia spend more than 3%. Poland spends almost 4%. Other than that, almost nobody meets their NATO commitment. France spends almost 2%, right around 2%. I would bet you $1 that the country he was talking about was Germany, because Germany, when Trump first came into office, was woefully under their 2% commitment. And what he was doing to them is saying, listen, we have this Article 5, but you guys have been free riding on American taxpayers for your defense, and it's time for you to start paying. And whatever country it was, I don't want to slander Germany if it wasn't them, whatever country it was, the leader said, well, what would you do if we didn't? Essentially daring Trump to ignore their failure to meet their commitment. And he answered with that. And so now people are taking that and blowing that up into something where they're saying, oh, Trump said he's not going to support NATO. It's not what he said at all. He was making a point that he knows how to be tough. And by the way, all those countries increased their NATO spending significantly. Germany is much higher than it was. It's still too low, but it's much higher than it was. France was lower. It's now up almost to 2% and so forth. So it worked.
Now, on the note of funds, Trump is now railing against the Senate foreign aid bill, saying that the money should instead be loaned. Now, what would that change if this money were loaned out? Is it accountability, transparency? What would that change?
Not much, to be honest with you. It's a good suggestion. It at least creates an obligation that after the war is over, when Ukraine returns to being a very wealthy, very prosperous country, that they would have a responsibility to pay us back. But, you know, there's something, if I may, there's an idea that they could do about Ukraine. Trump has a point about, and the Republicans have a point about spending in Ukraine. There are other ways to spend money to win the war in Ukraine. We should be encouraging Ukraine to use their spectacular military intelligence group that's had all these accomplishments in special operations to go after Putin's energy supply, go after the export ports, the production centers, the internal transport centers. They've been doing that for the last year. They should be encouraged to do more of that. It's a lot cheaper than artillery shells, and it would make the guys on Ukraine's front line safer, because it would deprive Putin of the money he needs to buy his weapons and his armaments and to pay more soldiers in his army. And that's the only way you're going to win it, is if you starve Putin. We should bankrupt Putin. We should bankrupt Putin, not ourselves, in this war.
Now, delving into this Senate foreign aid bill, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance is saying, quote, buried in the bill's text is an impeachment time bomb for the next Trump presidency if he tries to stop funding the war in Ukraine. This is something that Senator Rand Paul agrees with. Now, what would this mean if Trump does win his second term?
You know, the funny thing about this issue is everybody is expecting that Trump will win in November. They're all looking at the situation and they're saying, oh my gosh, Trump is coming back. And they're panicking. And I think J.D. Vance is right. I had not been aware of that issue until he tweeted about it. I went and I read his tweet. I read his letter. I looked at the language in the bill, and there really is a poison pill in there. They're setting up Trump so that if he says we are not going to spend this money in Ukraine again, that they can impeach him on the same grounds of the phony impeachment, whatever year that was, 2020. 2019, 2020, when they impeached him before. They expect him to win, and this is one of who knows how many hundreds or perhaps thousands of preparations that they're making so that they can undermine him again when he's president again.
Quite fascinating indeed. Bart Marcois, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me on.
Hur många NATO-länder kommer att nå försvarsutgiftsmålet på 2% av sin BNP 2024? NATOs generalsekreterare Jens Stoltenberg svarar på det.
I veckan skapades rubriker kring försvarsutgifterna för NATO-ländernas allierade av förre presidenten Donald Trump efter att ha pressat NATO-medlemmarna att uppfylla utgiftsmålet på 2%. NATOs generalsekreterare sa den 14 februari att drygt hälften av alla 31 medlemmar förväntas nå målet i år.
This year, I expect 18 allies to spend 2% of the GDP on defense. That is another record number.
2 vänskapsmatcher i fotboll med den argentinske stjärnan Lionel Messi har ställts in i Kina. Detta efter att han uteblev under en match i Hongkong, vilket ledde till att myndigheterna blev upprörda. Vi tittar på vad som hände.
2 kinesiska storstäder tackar nej till att ta emot Lionel Messi. I slutet av förra veckan ställde idrottsmyndigheterna i Peking och Hangzhou in 2 kommande fotbollsmatcher med Messi och hans lag. Pekings fotbollsförbund sa att man inte kommer att arrangera någon match där Messi deltar, vare sig det gäller Argentinas landslag eller Inter Miami. Avbokningarna skedde efter en vänskapsmatch i Hongkong där den argentinske fotbollsstjärnan satt kvar på bänken på grund av en rapporterad skada. Men allmänhetens upprördhet började intensifieras några dagar senare när Messi kom in på planen under en annan match i Japan, till synes utan spår av några skador. Kinas statligt stödda tabloid Global Times hävdar att Messis uteblivande var politiskt motiverat och tillade att detta påverkat saker, citat, långt utanför sportens område. En annan kontroversiell fråga är denna film som visar hur Messi gick förbi Hongkongs regeringschef John Lee utan att skaka hand med honom. Värt att notera är att Lee är välkänd för sin pro-kinesiska hållning. Han straffades av USAs finansdepartement 2020 på grund av sin roll i tillslaget mot prodemokratiska aktivister i Hongkong.
Vi är strax tillbaka.
En föreställning som verkligen betyder något. För var och en av oss. Detta är vad du har väntat på. Köp biljetter nu på chenyun.com.
Kinesiska kommunistpartiets främsta externa revolutionsprojekt i Afrika på 60-talet var hjälpen till Tanzania och Zambia. Man skickade ett stort antal experter från Shanghais textilindustribyrå för att hjälpa till att bygga upp en textilfabrik. Den ansvarige förde in ett starkt ideologiskt drag i de här biståndsprojekten. Vi kommer nu att visa del 6 i avsnittet Revolution på export i specialserien Hur kommunismens spöke styr världen. Filmen är baserad på boken How the Spectre of Communism is Ruling Our World.
Two, exporting revolution to Africa and Latin America. During the Cultural Revolution, the CCP often quoted a slogan by Karl Marx, quote, "The proletariat can liberate itself only by liberating all of humanity." The CCP preaches world revolution. In the 1960s, the former Soviet Union was going through a period of contraction and was forced to promote the cutback of external revolution. The goal became to peacefully coexist with Western capitalist countries and provide less support to the Third World revolutionary movements. The CCP called this policy revisionism. In the early 1960s, CCP ambassador to the Soviet Union, Wang Jiashang, made a similar proposal but was criticized by Mao as being too friendly to the imperialists, revisionists, and reactionaries, and not supportive enough to the world revolutionary movement. Therefore, in addition to exporting revolution to Asia, Mao also competed with the Soviet Union in Africa and Latin America. In August 1965, CCP Minister of National Defense Lin Biao claimed in his article, quote, "Long live the victory of the People's War," that a high tide in world revolution was imminent. According to Mao's theory of encircling the cities from rural areas, which is how the CCP seized power in China, the article compares North America and Western Europe to cities, and thinks of Asia, Africa, and Latin America as rural areas. Therefore, exporting revolution to Asia, Africa, and Latin America became an important political and ideological task for the CCP. A. Latin America. Professor Chung Ying Hong of the University of Delaware wrote the following in his article, quote, "Exporting Revolution to the World, an exploratory analysis of the influence of the Cultural Revolution in Asia, Africa, and Latin America." In Latin America, Maoist communists in the mid-1960s established organizations in Brazil, Peru, Bolivia, Colombia, Chile, Venezuela, and Ecuador. The main members were young people and students. With the support of China, in 1967, Maoists in Latin America established two guerrilla groups: the Popular Liberation Army of Colombia, which included a female company that mimicked the Red Detachment of Women and was called the Maria Cano Unit, and Bolivia's Nyancahuazu Guerrilla, or National Liberation Army of Bolivia. Some communists in Venezuela also launched armed violence actions in the same period. In addition, the left leader of the Peruvian Communist Party, Abimael Guzman, was trained in Beijing in the late 1960s. Apart from studying explosives and firearms, more importantly was his grasping of Mao Zedong thought, particularly ideas of, quote, "the spirit of transforming to matter," and that with the correct route, one can go from, quote, "not having personnel to having personnel, not having guns to having guns," and other mantras of the Cultural Revolution. Guzman was the leader of the Peruvian Communist Party, also known as the Shining Path, which was identified by the US, Canadian, EU, and Peruvian governments as a terrorist organization. In 1972, when Mexico and the CCP established diplomatic relations, the first Chinese ambassador to Mexico was Xiong Shenghui. Xiong was a CCP intelligence agent sent to monitor Hu Zongnan, a general in the Republic of China Army, during the Chinese Civil War. The intent behind making him the ambassador was to collect intelligence, including about the United States, and interfere with the Mexican government. Just 1 week before Xiong Shenghui took office, Mexico announced the arrest of a group of guerrillas trained in China. This is further evidence of the CCP's attempts at exporting revolution. Cuba was the first country in Latin America to establish diplomatic ties with the CCP. In order to win over Cuba and at the same time compete with the Soviet Union for the leadership of the international communist movement, the CCP extended to Che Guevara a $60 million loan in November 1960 when he visited China. This was at a time when the Chinese people were dying of starvation from the Great Leap Forward campaign. Zhou Enlai also told Guevara that the loan could be waived through negotiations. When Fidel Castro began leaning toward the Soviet Union, after Sino-Soviet relations broke down, the CCP sent a large number of propaganda pamphlets to Cuban officials and civilians through the embassy in Havana in an attempt to instigate a coup against the Castro regime. B. Africa. Chung also described, in the article Exporting Revolution to the World, How the CCP Influences the Independence of African Countries and What Kind of Path They Take After Independence. According to Western media reports, before the mid-1960s, some African revolutionary youth from Algeria, Angola, Mozambique, Guinea, Cameroon, and Congo received training in Harbin, Nanjing, and other Chinese cities. A member of the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, described his one-year training in Shanghai. In addition to military training, it was mainly political studies, how to mobilize rural people, and launch guerrilla warfare with the goal of people's war. An Oman guerrilla described his training received in China in 1968. He was sent by the organization first to Pakistan, then took a Pakistan airline plane to Shanghai, then to Beijing. After visiting model schools and communes in China, he was sent to a training camp for military training and ideological education. The curriculum of Mao Zedong's works was the most important in the schedule. Trainees must memorize many quotations from Mao. The part about discipline and how to interact with the rural masses was very similar to the, quote, 3 major disciplines and 8 items of attention used by the People's Liberation Army. The African trainees also witnessed China during the Cultural Revolution. For example, during a visit to a school, when a teacher asked how to treat gangster elements, students replied repeatedly in unison, "Kill, kill, kill." At the end of the training, every Omani trainee received a book by Mao translated into Arabic. Assistance to Tanzania and Zambia was the largest of the CCP's external revolution projects in Africa in the 1960s. The CCP sent a large number of experts from the Shanghai Textile Industry Bureau to help build the Tanzanian Friendship Textile Factory. The person in charge injected a strong ideological tone into these aid projects. Upon arrival in Tanzania, he organized a rebel team, hung the 5-star red flag of the PRC on the construction site, erected a statue of Mao and Mao's quotations, played Cultural Revolution music, and sang Mao quotes. The construction site became a model of the Cultural Revolution overseas. He also organized a propaganda team to promote Mao Zedong thought and actively spread rebellious views among the Tanzanian workers. Tanzania was not happy about the CCP's attempts to export revolution. Afterward, Mao decided to build a Tanzania-Zambia railway that would also connect East Africa with Central and Southern Africa. The railway passed through mountains, valleys, turbulent rivers, and lush forests. Many areas along the route were deserted and inhabited only by wildlife. Some of the roadbeds, bridges, and tunnels were constructed on foundations of silt and sand, making the work extremely difficult. There were 320 bridges and 22 tunnels built. China sent 50,000 laborers, of whom 66 died, and spent nearly 10 billion yuan. It took 6 years to complete the work, from 1970 to 1976. However, due to poor and corrupt management in Tanzania and Zambia, the railway went bankrupt. The equivalent cost of the railway today would be hundreds of billions of Chinese yuan, or in the tens of billions of US dollars.
Detta var den första delen av del 6 i vår specialserie Hur kommunismens spöke styr världen. För att se hela delen samt andra avsnitt gå till Ntd Sveriges kanaler på YouTube, Facebook och Gandring World. Tack för att ni har tittat och på återseende.